I'm Alan Robarge, a relationship coach and a psychotherapist. Welcome to Improve Your Relationships, where I like to talk about attachment injuries and healing attachment trauma. And on this video, let's talk about growing up gay and how that can create an impact or exacerbate attachment wounds, and that growing up gay to be violated in your sense of self, the wound of the development of the self, having been the target of aggression, be it direct, overt, covert, subtle, however it evolved in your life, in the circumstance, to realize it was you received some very powerful negative messaging that says you just can't be yourself. And if you are, you're not going to be loved. Well, this is enough to greatly contribute to creating attachment injuries. And if those attachment injuries continue to live in your nervous system, your psyche, and how you create relationships, they could show up as attachment trauma. And then some trauma symptoms could result when you're in relationship. Now, part of the greatest riddle or the challenge, almost the trickster nature of attachment trauma is that it lives in the place of emotional intimacy. So when you are attempting to be emotionally open and vulnerable and intimate and get to know someone and love someone and share your authentic self and reveal who you are, to be seen, known, heard, and understood, it is that very experience that becomes the trigger of the attachment trauma, that's where it lives. And now that's the gateway. That's where we open, where it becomes activated. So if you just hear how wicked and unfortunate that is, because you enter a relationship wanting to love and be loved, you enter a relationship wanting to risk being open and vulnerable, and it's the very risk, the act of doing that, if you have attachment injuries that show up as attachment trauma that are unintegrated, that they could trigger some core beliefs, some behaviors, some trauma symptoms that are adaptive behaviors to protect yourself, and could also link back to having been hurt and wounded in the development of yourself around your sexual orientation. It's all painful stuff. This video potentially is going to be long. I have a whole series of notes here, and I have my iced coffee if I need it. But let's jump in, and I'm going to go through my notes to set up what took place, but then look at the consequences and the core beliefs that get set up that might still be impacting or influencing how you're in relationship today. Before I move into those consequences and core beliefs, let me share a disclaimer to acknowledge that what I'm sharing is potentially generational, that there are different generations, different time periods, different ages of people that will or will not have experienced to certain degrees what I'm talking about. And so I'm just acknowledging that there is a range here. This also might be true of gender identity and identification around masculinity and femininity, because so much of the identity, what's linked to sexual orientation around your identity, also includes becoming a man, becoming a woman, and let's just be sensitive to all people who don't identify in that binary way of languaging gender. But I'm, as a disclaimer, saying that there's a generational piece, and then there's also a gender piece here that will influence the degree to which you might or might not have been wounded in your development of the self, and the degree to which you can get behind and agree or believe with what I'm sharing. So keep that in mind. I also want to acknowledge as a disclaimer that there is a chicken and an egg quality of looking at, well, what came first. And what I mean by this is that most probably, chances are, if you have an attachment wound, and if you come from, if your attachment style is that of being insecurely attached, chances are it is also directly linked with your family system and what was going on in your relationships and the quality of bonding with your parents and your primary caregivers and other family members. And so it becomes entwined and mixed when we're trying to talk about the violation and the wound of your development of your sense of self around being the target and object of aggression and contempt for your sexual orientation. That is going to greatly impact how you feel about yourself and how you show up in the world, and then you feel like you need to hide and you can't really be yourself, and so people you're holding yourself back, so it's really limiting how you're able to create relationships. But chances are that was probably not the only thing going on. You also have this other flavor, other ingredients of family relationships where insecure attachment is also already present. In order for us to frame this from having experienced attachment trauma and living with attachment trauma today. Now, I also want to point out that what we're talking about is a violation to your identity. And this is an attack on sexual expression and on that sexuality and the sexual energy that it represents. And so we're not only talking about sexual behavior, we're talking about how sexual energy and sexuality itself links to the attachment system, because that's how we are attracted to people and that's how we connect and bond. And there might be some, sexual expression in there, but it's very intertwined with our wanting to be in relationship. And then simultaneously, it's very intertwined with our identity and who we are as a person. Because we come from a place of when you're attracted to someone and when you express your attraction and you own your sexual identity and you own your feelings and you're able to reveal them, you're grounded in your sense of agency to take action, to be yourself. And so the wound that we're talking about here, the violation that we're talking about here, is that you received messaging that set up core beliefs in your psyche or in your mind that you're not welcome to be yourself. And so this can very much impact then how you create relationships, and it impacts how you feel about yourself. When you grow up in a family that is negative, judgmental, hostile, or unwelcoming of your maturing into your adult sexual self, then it is a wound of discrediting your worth. It is a wound of abandonment. And here's what I really like. It's the wound of the anticipation of abandonment. You don't actually have to have been abandoned. If you lived in the fear, in chronic fear of potentially being abandoned, that's enough to provoke your nervous system and set up, to deny. You're so on edge. There's just this part of you in your everyday life growing up chronically with this fear, the anticipation of, well, if people really knew who you are and really were able to know about your sexual orientation, your homosexuality, well, then you'd be abandoned. So even if you weren't technically abandoned, this kind of wounding around an abandonment wound could have been set up in your life. This is also a wound of conditional love. I will love you if you're not gay, or I will love you if you are straight, or I will love you as long as you never reveal that part of you that we don't want to know about. It is a wound of hiding and shutting down and disconnecting to yourself. So not only in general, or many, many times, we're not only disconnecting from revealing ourselves to others, we're doing this on such a... the degree of being frightened of being exposed and shamed is so intense that not only are we hiding ourselves from others, but we learn how to hide ourselves from ourselves. This is a wound of shame, and this is shame as defined as toxic shame, which means that you believe you're fundamentally flawed as a human being and there's something wrong with you. You're disgusting and you should not be who you are. This type of shame is really toxic and pervasively undermines your ability to ever feel good about yourself. And it is a shame that sets up this core belief that you're somehow flawed and that you're just inherently less than. This is what happens when we experience a wounding to our development of ourself, when our sexual orientation is attacked and not embraced and not valued and not nurtured. And that we could then say that we have a wound of the development of the self. The results of this are insidious, as you can imagine, that it really does a number on your sense of self. And as I've mentioned earlier, it could create a series of consequences and or lingering core beliefs that we take into our adulthood and we bring into our adult relationships. One consequence is that this could plant the seeds of suspicion of your lovability, that you will have an underlying fear of not fully being accepted. You know, you could go through the motions, you could really, you know, remind yourself that you're loved, do reality testing that you're loved, but there's this underlying gnawing feeling internally that you're just not lovable. And this is one of the consequences of having lived in or lived through an environment where your sense of self was violated, and that you question your lovability. The impossible riddle, a paradox that presents itself here around a core belief, is that, well, you could be loved, but only if you're not known. And you already hear how crazy making this is. So you could be loved as long as you're not known. And for many people who very much had to hide and make sure their sexual orientation, their sexual feelings were not openly exposed and shared and valued, and that was in an environment where you needed to make sure that that's hidden, and yet you're experiencing people loving you, the messaging that it's sending, the belief that could solidify is, yes, you're loved, but as long as you're not known. And here's the other part. And if you are known, if you do reveal yourself, you won't be loved. So it's a self-generating shame, a shame riddle or a shame paradox where you must stay in a place of being not known. So do you see how incredibly challenging this could be as an adult around your fear of risking being authentic? And you might have you might err on the side of withholding, just naturally withholding to protect yourself. Because the core messaging is that it is really not safe to be known. And usually for many of us, what's underneath that is this real aching desire, this aching feeling, this very painful place of you want nothing more than to be known, to be accepted. There's going to be a fear of being rejected, but there's also a fear of being accepted, of actually getting what you want, because you just don't believe that you'll get it, and if you actually get set up to get it, you'll be told that you're unlovable, and that there will be a culmination in fulfilling the negative core messaging, and fulfilling, that's being in alignment with the belief system of the wound, that the culmination is that you will be ultimately rejected, and you will be told that you're unlovable, and that you will be told that, yes, we do see you, we do know you now, and we don't really like what we know. So your worst fear, your abandonment fear, has come true. We don't want to be in relationship with you anymore. So these beliefs can really impact how we pick partners and how we show up in relationship. Now, another consequence of this, and this is somewhat of a repeat already up to this point, is just acknowledging that this whole violation to your sense of yourself and being the target of having aggression and negativity directed at you can set up attachment trauma, attachment wounds, and abandonment wounds. And as I've already mentioned, it could be the anticipation of abandonment that could be enough to set this up as an attachment trauma in your mind and in your nervous system. You grew up feeling fundamentally that you are not seen, known, heard, or understood. And so that would mean as an adult, you have this underlying feeling, this gnawing feeling that people don't really see you, people don't really know you, people don't really want to listen to you, and people don't really get you. And so oftentimes it's identified as an outsider status. You just feel like, you're the odd person out, you're the odd bird, you march to your own drummer, because you've had a lifetime of this discord, a lifetime where the environment, the people around you in the community did not want to know really who you are, and you got the messaging that said, oh no, don't reveal who you are. So there were some limitations to you being fully seen, known, heard, and understood, and this is the makings, these are the ingredients of how attachment injuries or insecure attachment patterns get set up in our life. Another consequence, and this somewhat links to shame, but another consequence of growing up gay and how that impacts your attachment system is that you're told, you have a core belief, what comes out of this is that who you are is worthy of contempt, which that links to the shame, meaning it's not your shame, but it's the cultural shame, being shamed, that you're worthy of contempt. But not only that, that you're worthy of punishment and violence. And this could again be the potential threat, going to school, grade school, being bullied, literal violence, being hurt, being punished, being kicked, being punched. And again, when we talk about the anticipation of abandonment, it can also, present as an abusive scenario in your psyche, that if you weren't literally punched or literally bullied, it's just the ongoing chronic fear of daily feeling like you can't be yourself, and that if you are exposed in any way, then there will be a consequence of physically being hurt. So as you can imagine, this is going to dramatically make people cautious around revealing who they are. And even when you're in an adult relationship with someone that you love, you might still have this underlying core belief that you don't deserve better, and that you could pick a partner who actually directs aggression and negativity towards you. and holds you in contempt and shames you. And you could even find yourself entering abusive relationships because this core belief has been set up in your life that on a certain level, you think that you deserve it. So this very much can be a consequence and a possible outcome of growing up gay, and how the violation to your sexual orientation and violating your sense of self can impact how you create relationships today. Also, talking about the consequence of violence and punishment, we could also come with, it could also be a much broader, it might not manifest in our individual relationships, but it's just an underlying feeling that the world is not safe for me. And it could come with a fear of persecution. And I like to refer to this as the fear of the townspeople with the pitchforks. The townspeople with the pitchforks are coming to get you. And I once heard a phrase that I really liked, saying, it's not paranoia if there's actually people out there who want to hurt you. It's not paranoia if there's actually people out there who would direct aggression towards you or are directing aggression towards you. So the consequence of growing up in this environment could make you all the more hyper alert and sensitive to being the target of aggression in your life. And it could create a kind of low level ongoing fear of somehow being persecuted or somehow being punished by right of just being yourself. And it's also possible this could come up in a work situation, you know, perceiving a situation, being very quick to interpret a situation that you're being persecuted, and maybe very much perhaps you are, maybe there's some negativity, but it's going to link up with this unresolved trauma around your identity. And if it's linking to an attachment trauma, and then the result is feeling like, you know, you're unnecessarily being punished or feeling that someone's out to get you. And it could show up like in a work scenario or in a school or university setting, somewhere where there's this like kind of sense of an institution or organization coming after you. This potentially is a consequence that you might be living with and need to be aware of as you are maturing and growing and deepening in your sense of self. Another consequence is that you might be hypersensitive, that you have a hypersensitive alertness to people around you and how you're being perceived. So if you're growing up or you have to hide who you are, you will develop this radar system, this highly sensitive radar system, where you have eyes in the back of your head and you have eyes on your shoulders, and you have, before 360 cameras existed, your brain was a 360 camera, and you were very hyper sensitive and hyper alert, which, keep in mind, this hyper alertness is a trauma symptom or can be a trauma symptom. So living in a state of hyper arousal or constant hyper, to be on, you're just on. So growing up, if you go to the football game, you're just on. If you're in gym class, you're just on. If you're, meeting a new group of people, you got invited to a party and, you're at that awkward teenager age years and you're just on. And naturally, many teenagers already are a bit, concerned about their image and presenting themselves. But for someone who also, the stakes are being exposed as being, disgusting, something is wrong with you, you are, exposing, revealing the degree of shame, being publicly shamed if any of this ever got out. It just means that your nervous system got cranked up to pay attention, to not put yourself in situations where you would be exposed or incriminated, and to not put yourself in situations of any potential threat, where people could call you names or, punch you in the head or, whatever happened. So it meant that you really were monitoring yourself all the time. And for a number of people, this meant like living in an abusive scenario. Like the environment that you're living in is hostile, and the result is essentially, even if your home life is not one of domestic violence, we could make the argument that you're living in an environment where you're chronically always on edge and you're looking around to make sure that no one is going to find fault with your being, you. And no one's going to find fault with you showing up in your fullness. You received messaging that said, don't be in your fullness. Don't show up. Instead, be hyper alert, be on the lookout, be on guard, be cautious, hold back, and hide. So can you imagine how this impacts your relationships if when you start entering emotional connection with a loving person who wants to get to know you, the very act of revealing yourself could stir up all of these core beliefs. Even if you've done healing work on this before, even if you really logically get it, you psychologically have matured into a place of understanding that that's not who you are, you're out of the closet, you love who you are, you very much have matured. But it's this attachment trauma that when it has to do with interpersonal relating and when it has to do with revealing yourself emotionally on this very, very tender, raw place around revealing your wanting to connect through loving and being loved, that's the place that we still feel insecure and where our attachment trauma gets triggered and we lose resource. And even though we have all this other history of quote unquote living, life out of the closet, living as a gay person, living as a lesbian person, living in whatever, terminology or label that you want to give yourself, you might still find yourself when you're going into these deeper levels of emotional connection that these core beliefs and these old feelings get triggered again, even years and years later. So that's really why I'm making this video, is to give us a heads up that you're not alone, that if you notice, despite being secure and managing your life in many other areas and having, a solid foundation of, emotional truth and how you show up, when it comes to interpersonal relating with a partner or entering dating or, long-term relationship, some of this old crap and bullshit is still there and still gets provoked. Now, also the same thing related to a consequence around the hypersensitivity and the alertness. Just to clarify that a result or a consequence of that hypersensitive alertness, that you trained yourself to always be aware and on, you're always on, is that this creates confusion around authenticity. You really doubt when to be authentic, and at some point you might even lose touch of knowing how. Another consequence, to keep going with this list here, and excuse me, could be overcompensating. Very much overcompensating in your personality, but overcompensating to exaggerate your worth because you need to cover up the internalized messaging of being worthless. So again, this is related to shame, internalized shame, and how this attacks your sense of worth, and an adaptive response to living with these very, very painful feelings and living with this impossible situation is we have to come up with ways to make ourselves more attractive and shiny, and ways to get praise and attention to protect ourselves from ever being exposed for the thing that we are trained to hate about ourselves. So we could overcompensate and exaggerate our sense of worth. And we do this because we need to cover up our internalized messaging of being worthless. Now, this overcompensation can come in multiple forms, and I think I've just listed 3 of them here, but one could be to, and keep in mind these could all be opposites, that what I'm going to say, the pendulum could swing the total other way, but it could be, really overcompensating through charisma and being gregarious and really being the life of the party and having a winning personality. And so that, you're trying to prove to everybody, and usually this isn't conscious, this is just an adaptive response, but we deep down feel like we're going to be rejected for who we are as a person, and we're receiving this messaging that says we cannot really be ourselves. So there's a kind of response that says, oh yeah, well, I'll show you, I'll really be shiny and wonderful and amazing, and I'll be gregarious and I'll be charismatic. And I'm just going to, and for some people, this means that they become really nice, they become really super friendly, they become super helpful. There's just this kind of extraordinary quality to the expression of the personality. And if we really look underneath it, it's all designed as smoke and mirrors to cover up ever revealing the shame. This also might take the form of perfectionism, needing to control outcomes and manipulating, showing your flawlessness or showing your flawless skill. And if we can keep everything tidy and neat and together and organized and have this perfectionist approach, it means that we're just going to really limit, we're going to really manufacture the packaging that we're presenting. And it will really limit the openings of where someone can actually see us. They're not really going to see us because we have things so tightly organized, and the presentation has this great lovely bow on it, and it's wrapped really nice. And it's our perfectionism that's going to create a buffer from other people actually getting to know us. And do you see, if you take this skill into your adult relationships, it's going to challenge your ability to be intimate with your partner if your perfectionism is going to get in the way. If you're still using this adaptive style, this adaptive behavior that was designed out of dysfunction and being violated in your sense of self, if you're still holding on to that adaptive behavior and trying to bring it into your relationship with a partner, then chances are you're not going to strengthen emotional connection with your partner. You're going to do what this adaptive behavior was designed to do, which is to keep you disconnected, keep you hidden, and to push your partner away. The same thing goes, let me just backtrack, for this idea of being charismatic or developing some kind of big personality where, you really have a bit of a shine to you, a bit of a presence. And you've developed that presence and that charisma because it's a facade, it's a wall that you can use that will push people away. And you're able to stay protected. You're able to make people believe that you're just this really, incredible personality. But in fact, it's simultaneously designed that you're not actually creating connection. It's your emotional connection, your relationships will suffer because this is an adaptive behavior that you're still using, that was born out of dysfunction and that you actually no longer need, but you're still using it because it's folded into your personality at this point and it's who you are. So you got to really, really be conscious of noticing how you're defaulting to some of these behaviors and maybe experiment with doing something different. And that's going to feel risky, and that's going to make you feel exposed, and that's going to make you feel messy, and you're not going to be as charismatic, and things aren't going to be as perfect as you'd like them to be. It's going to feel messy. The last thing or point to make here regarding the perfectionism is also about achievement-based esteem, that you set up this dynamic, this wounding of your development of yourself and being violated around your sexuality, your sexual feelings, your sexual orientation, is that one way that you protected yourself through overcompensating was through achievements. And so then you set up this dynamic that your worth is linked to being the superstar. And this is often why people are overachievers and why they, are very successful in business. But again, it's designed in such a way to say, well, you can't really touch me, you can't really hate on me, you can't really belittle my sense of worth anymore, because look at how amazingly successful I am, and because of it, I have created a barrier between you and me. The goodness of these adaptive behaviors are that they're all designed in such a way to try to, set up boundaries to say you cannot keep doing this to me. Unfortunately, they were derived out of a response of overcompensating, so they're still going to push people away. And I think this is the fourth or fifth time that I've already said it. It's so important. I'm going to say it again. Do you see how if you're still doing these things and you bring this to your current adult relationship, it's going to challenge you to create a foundation of secure attachment and openness and emotional connection with your partner if you still have these obstacles here. And let's acknowledge, being with a partner, a gay or lesbian partner, most probably has some of the same similar belief systems and consequences or history to any varying degree. And so now you both of this is getting activated for both of you. And let me just repeat, as I said, some of this can also, the pendulum can swing the other way, so we could just play with opposites. So if your overcompensating strategy is the opposite of charisma, you might just become this boring wallflower who's so not engaged in life. Or if your overcompensating strategy, an adaptive response, was the opposite of perfectionism, you might just really be sloppy and messy and you just can't hold it together. And then the last one around achievement is just, not pursuing your dreams. You're not worth it. You're not going to put in that application to that school. You're not going to go for that job. You're not going to try to learn that skill because, if you do, you'll be exposed. The way it gets set up in your mind is that you don't want to call your adaptive response was hide, don't be the shining star. Don't call attention to yourself. Don't be extra. So playing with opposites can help us here. Let's keep going. Consequences of this. I'm covering all of them. This is a long video, but I want this to be thorough. Another consequence, the resulting belief, is that you just don't belong. You just fundamentally don't belong. And this sets up a feeling of chronic separateness, a chronic wandering, a chronic isolation, and a loneliness. And that if you don't belong, it's very possible that you have no sense of home, and that you never did, because growing up, home was a place where you were violated, your sense of self was violated, you were the object and the target of aggression. And that if you endured a wound to the development of yourself in the home environment or in the community while you're living at home, it makes sense that your brain associates home with not being a safe place. And what is a very natural response to living in that level of fear and in a place that's very hostile to you being yourself? It says, I'm getting out of here. I'm leaving. I'm not going to live here with these people. I'm not going to live in this town, in this community. I got to get out of here. However, for a number of people, on a very psychic level, and when it has to do with this unresolved attachment wound, and it has to do with this history that you have not fully integrated how it has impacted you, it might mean that a sense of home continues today, years and years and years later, to elude you, and that you don't have a sense of belonging. And even and you might have fleeting moments. You might move from city to city. You might move from apartment to apartment. You might go from job to job. You might shift groups of friends and try different hobbies, this, that, and the other. But this very much, this violation of the wound, of the development of yourself, could take hold and manifest with the consequence that you just don't feel you belong anywhere. Now, again, do you see how this could impact how you find partners, how you communicate that you want to create roots and set up a home with a partner, whether or not you're able to stay long enough in one place, whether or not you could create a home not only for yourself but with your partner? And that if you fundamentally have a core belief that you don't belong and that home is not, is always an uneasy, unsettled place, that will be challenging to drop down into planting the seeds and creating roots to create a home with a partner. So it's really important to uncover, what are some of the consequences of having grown up gay where your sense of self was violated in this way, and that your sense of self was so diminished that you might bring with you into your adult relationships this inability to feel that you belong. It might show up as a restlessness, and no matter, always needing to do something, always needing to move with your partner. You just never quite settle down. You just never quite feel comfortable. So let's keep going. Another consequence of this dynamic is the separation of love from sex. And this means that there's a compartmentalization, a disconnect between these very fundamental parts of yourself, and that there's a polarization or an internal rift, and that sexual activity, sexual feeling, sexual desire becomes very compartmentalized and separate from the warmth of love and feeling emotional connection. When this happens, it is going to send mixed messages to your partner and or be internally confusing to you. And this also sets up for a number of people some challenges around where they have partners on the side for sex and they have a partner for emotional connection, and the two never mix. And or they try to make them mix, but they just feel fundamentally disconnected. So from a healing work perspective and trying to reclaim how this history has impacted you, you might want to look at, well, do you believe that these two things are separate and compartmentalized? And is there a way that you can begin through your healing work to create some kind of bridge to bring them together? Now, also, it's a potential consequence of this history that you might developmentally, emotionally be a younger age. So that when in real life you're 34, in real life you're, 46, but your emotional age could be 16. Your emotional age could, be 14. And so if there was a thwarting where you had to shut down your development at age 13, age 14, age 15, it's very possible that when you are entering emotional relationship or you're with your partner and you're experimenting with being emotionally open, that you find yourself regressing, either conscious or unconscious, coming from a skill where you left off in your development. And that is a potential consequence of this happening. Also, another consequence is that you missed out on rites of passage in the community. Community rites of passage that would affirm your coming into adulthood. So for heterosexual people who have ways that publicly acknowledge when someone is developing into their older adult self, when someone is coming into their looks, when someone, asking questions, what boyfriend or girlfriend are you interested in now? And it is totally normal for the heterosexual culture to endorse the younger people beginning to date, and it really affirms and nurtures and honors that they have these feelings. Well, if you were someone who needed to hide and lived in a community that did not value the beauty and the goodness of your having attraction towards someone of the same sex, then you've missed out on some very important community rites of passage that would affirm your sense of self, affirm your gender, affirm your identity. So think of terms of a homecoming dance. A homecoming, it's like a festival of heterosexuality. It's, the king and the queen, and just acknowledging everyone has a date and everyone is paired up. And just to go through, the whole town gets on board and there's a parade and people are on the floats and people are waving. You are unwelcome. You're left out of that entire community experience that, of course, it's not only about coupling, but it has that component and aspect that it is supported and endorsed that everyone pick a date and go to the really important dance with your date. Well, if you did not have that, if you are not able to pick your same-sex partner and have the same fanfare and parade and the community rallying around you to validate and mirror back to you the goodness of your attraction towards the person you're attracted to, that in this case happens to be someone of the same sex, well, then you're an outsider and you missed out, and it's possible that developmentally you were denied these rites of passage. And that could reinforce why you feel like an outsider. The community was not there for you. And so the core belief that this could also simultaneously create and reinforce is that you're really on your own. Do it yourself, give yourself what you need, live your life. You are so independent because these people here are not going to notice you or welcome you into the parade or welcome you into the collective experience, because you will always, you will not find yourself mirrored back to you. Your feelings will not be mirrored back for who you are. Now, as a last consequence to point out, and this one's a little tricky or has a bit of a layer to it, everything that I'm talking about, a consequence of this can get wrapped up in saying that this is a narrative of being wounded. So even, any, bigger straight culture, or there's an awareness of people, unless you're totally clueless and living under a rock, no one is surprised about, this idea, some of these things I'm talking about. No one is surprised about the impact and how hurtful it is for a gay person to grow up in the closet and to be denied their sense of self. So that part is not surprising. However, a consequence of this might be that the narrative itself that you're wounded is that this is a kind of wounding on top of a wounding, and that we now tell the story that you're wounded. Oh, you came from the closet. Oh, you're gay. Oh, right. You were totally ignored as a child. You weren't really allowed to be you grew up in the closet. Oh, you poor thing. You're shame-based. Oh, right. You have a relationship to shame. Oh, that's going to really impact your relationships. So although I value everything I said, we, up to this point, noticing we're up to, 45 minutes on this video. Everything up to 45 minutes, is valid. But keep in mind, if we collectively pull it all together, we even say that is a narrative, a wounding narrative. And even that gets placed on top of people who have this history of growing up gay. And it's a kind of wounding on top of a wounding, because it is rooted in a deficiency. It is not strengths-based. And it says that, well, obviously it makes sense that you struggle in a relationship because that thing happened to you. That history happened to you. Obviously, you're still struggling with shame, and we got to work to accept, we'll let you know that we accept you because we know your history of not being accepted. There is a kernel of kindness and truth and altruism to that, but it is also a repetitive narrative that keeps you wounded because it says that you're fucked up because you had this experience. And so it's a very tricky edge to work with to make sure that even though you know these things have impacted you, that you're not also totally giving into the story as a narrative of being wounded. Because even that can keep you stuck, looping, disconnected from your personal power and disconnected from your truth of living out who you are. And that we say that yes, this could have impacted you, but it's not all or only who you are. That you do have a fundamental core being of goodness that has been spared any of this bullshit, and that you don't have to fully swallow the pill of being the wounded gay person. And that is a really, really important cultural piece to transcend. That's in a way, that's still a part of the narrative or a continuation of belittling your worth. Is to say, even as an adult, even after coming out of the closet, even after having many relationships, even after, feeling really good about who you are, oh, but you have this history of because you grew up in the closet and because you're gay and the world didn't really accept you. That here's this narrative of being the wounded gay person. Well, the simple way to confront that is just say, fuck you. That's just that's really irritating. It's a projection of the victim mentality onto your continued sense of self. And that's what I'm pointing out. So be careful with totally buying into that. The core beliefs, just to repeat here, that get set up are: you will never really be loved, you are not lovable, you will be punished for being yourself, your core self is despicable and worthy of contempt, you cannot be loved and known at the same time, because if you really were known, you wouldn't be loved anymore, and you better hide. It is not safe to be you. Now, what's a more resource, strengths-based presentation of these consequences? The way that I explained them up to this point has been about the impact as a deficiency. We could also flip them around and frame them from a strengths-based place, so that because of your disenfranchisement, this experience of oppression is actually a gateway to compassion and sensitivity. So yes, you might have to make peace with the grief of being treated so poorly and the grief of being trained to disconnect from your own being. But in the process of doing that and coming to terms with that grief and aligning with the experience of being disenfranchised from yourself and being ostracized from community and living in a system of oppression, that actually is a gateway to compassion. And that is a gateway to sensitivity. And that is a gateway to kindness. And if you nurture those qualities, and if you follow that path of sensitivity, compassion, and kindness, and you bring that to your relationships, that's the place where you're going to love your partner and how you're going to continue to love yourself. And that's the place you're going to build a relationship that is not acting out attachment trauma, but deepening insecure attachment. And so it's knowing the pain and the sadness of the oppression and the disenfranchisement and how you were so poorly treated in the violation of yourself, your sense of self. But it is a gateway that opens you to compassion and kindness. And you can bring that compassion and kindness to your relationships with your partner and to your friends. Now, another way of framing all these consequences is that your spirit perseveres and that you're most likely adaptable. You have been trained to be a shapeshifter. You have been trained to be a chameleon. You have been trained to become a bridge, to link to different groups of people and to adapt. And you probably do this flawlessly and seamlessly. And if you have that personality of charisma, you also probably do it with a little bit of charm and finesse. So the beauty of this particular consequence, when we come at it from a strengths-based place, is that this is a very valuable skill in how to bring people together. And this is the kind of skill that people use in mediation. This is the kind of skill that therapists use. And this is the kind of skill to bridge disconnect between communities. So it's very possible that you are using this adaptive skill from a strengths-based place in your work. And your ability to adapt and shapeshift, in fact, can be an asset. And when you are revealing your authentic self, when you're grounded in your authenticity, but on top of it, using this ability, this adaptability, that is gold. So that is a great gift of this wound. And I hate that phrase, gift of, ugh. Sorry I said that, but it is true in this moment, the context in which I mean it. But it just is always so cliche and sounds saccharine. So forgive me for that. Another way of framing the consequence of this is to put the strengths-based place of the consequence is that you value and prize emotional honesty and connection because you know what it's like to go without. And oh, there's such sadness there. I feel such sadness when I share that one. You value and prize emotional honesty and connection because you know what it's like to go without. So imagine you bring that to your relationships. You know what it's like to not have emotional connection, to not reveal yourself, to not be with another person who offers emotional openness. And so just you have a heightened, the quality, it's almost, in my opinion, it's a kind of humbleness or humility where you really appreciate when emotional connection is offered to you and you know how to respond in kind because you know what it's like to be denied that. So this is a way of turning around the consequences so they're not rooted in being wounded, but in fact, these are adaptable skills that if you really consciously apply them, can help your relationships. The last one is that you've chosen and realized, you have chosen and realized a long time ago that you're going to live a life of integrity and authenticity. This is a noble struggle. This is a noble path. And so it really ups the stakes and raises the bar to living a life of integrity. That you know what it's like to be denied being an authentic self. So when you finally come into the grounded place of showing up with your authentic self, the challenge is to do this with your partner and to do this in a loving, emotionally connected relationship so that you don't fall apart or implode in your own fear, and to be able to be in the fullness of being seen, known, and heard with your partner. And when you do this, you're living a life of integrity and authenticity because that is important to you. That's very possible a response or outcome to all of these consequences. So how does this impact your relationships and what does this mean for attachment trauma? Simplistically, it means that this old shit and disconnect from yourself can get triggered at any time. And that you need to have the skills to discern when you are regressing into these old patterns and these old beliefs and some of the trauma energy around being denied a sense of self is happening, and that you don't lose yourself in relationship. So the great challenge here is that you potentially will struggle to stay present in your relationship. And we could frame that, a simple way also of saying that is to introduce or just acknowledge codependency is the inability to stay grounded and stay in our sense of self, and we become overly focused on the other person and how we can be a reflection of who they want us to be. And does that sound familiar? You see, you are set up that way. So this whole wounding of the development of the self, of having aggression and negativity directed at your sexual orientation, potentially we could make the argument, trained you to be codependent in relationship, to not have a self and to mirror back to other people who you think they want you to be. So that could be a result or a consequence. So how this could impact your relationships is that some of these old patterns could get triggered and activated, and so you need to stay alert and observe and monitor yourself to make sure that you're not repeating these old patterns. Things to do to work out, to work with the attachment trauma and counter the old messaging. things to do, to just repeating, to work with this attachment trauma and to counter this old messaging. You need corrective experiences of acceptance and belonging. And this one is ongoing. You will always have corrective experiences where your brain gets a chance to overwrite the old with some new positive experience where you are being received, you are being embraced, you are being valued for who you are. And you have to experiment with being vulnerable in situations that really touch your heart, in situations that expose you, and go to that deeper place where you are risking being more open and vulnerable. But as a result, doing this from a grounded, mature place with people that you feel safe with could help your brain overwrite that old programming. These are corrective experiences of acceptance and belonging. You also need to transfer the carried shame back to the source because it is not yours. So carried shame is all the shame that was dumped on you by your family, and all the shame that was dumped on you by your community, and all the shame that was dumped on you by the culture. We internalize that, and it becomes personal, and it becomes intertwined with our own sense of shame, and it becomes very, very challenging to sort it out. But one way to work with it therapeutically and from a healing perspective is to really think about giving back the shame that it never was yours to begin with. You can't heal it or make sense of it or continue to carry it around because it's not yours. And the technical term for this, there's some information you could, Google and review and look up, is the phrase carried shame. It is not yours, so you can let it go. Also, we need to frame our sexual orientation, our desire, and our expression as meaningful, not superfluous, not disgusting, not impotent, but powerfully potent, to reclaim the goodness of being gay and the goodness of gay sensibility. Your identity transcends your sexuality. There's more here than just sexual feelings. It is a sensibility. There is a goodness in being gay. There is a way of seeing. It's a way of thinking. It's a vibration. It's a music. It's an understanding that straight people don't have. And for some, it is even a unique spirituality. And I can guarantee you, I tell you, stand in a circle of 60 straight men and then stand in a circle of 60 gay people, 60 gay men. It is very different. There's a different quality, a different culture, a different energy, a different vibration. And I refer to this as gay sensibility. So one way to heal this history is to frame your sexual orientation, your desire and your expression as something meaningful. Because the core messaging that the culture still to this day has is that it is unimportant and meaningless. It's superfluous. It doesn't mean anything. Who cares? You're gay. So my response to that is we do care. It is meaningful. It actually does have a rich history. There is such a thing as gay sensibility, a kind of knowing, an innate awareness, a unique perspective, a creativity that is informed by your sexual orientation, by your sexual attraction, by your identity. And we need to claim that as something grounded in goodness, not grounded in the violation of being told that it means nothing, and not grounded in the impotence of superfluous meaninglessness. It really needs to be elevated and to really contemplate that there is some goodness to this history, to this identity that you have inherited as a human being, and to embrace it. And one way to do that is through culture and realize gay history, and to meet other gay or go meet other gay groups of people, and to really value knowing that there is a unique culture that, although is not celebrated by the masses, is very beautiful and full of goodness. And that in and of itself can also help to create a corrective experience to undo all those years of the negative messaging that says, well, gay people aren't really that important. They don't really contribute to society anyway. They're like, why would we even talk about them? So look up gay history. That's very important. We need to educate ourselves about attachment trauma. This is the last piece in the end of this video, is that attachment trauma, these symptoms will get triggered and activated if this history of growing up gay has lodged itself into your attachment system and shows up as attachment trauma. So one way to work with this in order to communicate to your partner of why you're behaving the way that you're behaving, in order to observe in your partner why your partner might be behaving the way he or she is behaving, is to go ahead and educate yourself on what are the symptoms of trauma and how, and also what is attachment trauma and what are some of the ways to work with it, and certain healing modalities of working with body-based experience and a felt sense experience in the body to work with the activation when the nervous system gets triggered with some panic and some anxiety and some distress, some attachment distress. So one way to heal or to work with this history is to educate yourself about attachment trauma. And then lastly, I'm just going to real quick read all of those. You need corrective experiences of acceptance and belonging in order to work with this attachment trauma. You need to transfer your carried shame back to the source. It is not yours. Give it up. You need to frame your sexual orientation, desire, and expression as from the point of view of meaningful purpose. And you need to educate yourself about what is attachment trauma and how do you have some tools in your tool bag, some healing tools to work with it when you are triggered. Thank you for listening. Very long video. I hope that this is helpful. Blessing to everyone who has returned, come out from the other side of this history of having been hurt and violated for who you are as a human being. And good for you that you are rising above and that you are dropping into a deeper sense of your truth and authenticity. It is challenging. It will continue to be challenging in relationships at times where you will default or return to hiding and or obscuring, revealing yourself. You make mental note of that, you share it with your partner, you be honest with yourself, and you continue to take risk. You are welcome and invited to be yourself and continue to not hide, but to be open. And this is living in acceptance. So good for you, empathy for you, blessing to everyone who has had this experience, this hurtful experience. And please continue to share this message with other people who need to hear that you can be yourself. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Also, if you want to join a community of like-minded people who like to discuss relationships and attachment trauma and attachment injuries, and how do we learn skills of self-directed healing in order to continue to grow and evolve as human beings, well, please check out the membership community, Improve Your Relationships. You can find the URL here and then also in the description of this YouTube video. Thank you for watching.